Hey guys, Setch here. Long time no see. It's been a while since I've uploaded anything to YouTube, but I'm still out here and still having fun. I've been playing simulator battles for the last several months. I put together a little sizzle reel of my first few months playing, and I've had a lot of fun transferring over from arcade, and I intend to make some videos about that. But first, just as a little shorter objective to sort of whet my appetite and get back into this, I thought I would do a simple little demo video doing takeoff and landing in my favorite aircraft here, the Lightning, because a lot of my friends, when they try and fly these with me, they complain that the plane is difficult to land in particular. So I'll go through the steps, and well, hopefully it will be helpful. So here we go. I will start out by turning on manual engine control, which is just something that I'm in the process of learning and experimenting with. Not really much to say right now. I'll just give myself about 90% prop pitch and open the radiators. And I intend to do a video later that talks about manual engine control in more depth, but for now that's about all we need to know. I'll go ahead and start the engines, and we'll give ourselves about combat flaps. The P-38 can take off, given enough runway, take off without flaps, but you wind up getting a little bit faster when you do that, throttling up. Takeoff flaps, not really necessary, maybe if you're carrying ordnance or something. Usually combat flaps are adequate. Once we get to around 170 or so kilometers an hour, just pull back gently, and the plane just lifts right up off the runway. I'll go ahead and raise gear, raise flaps, and give myself a little bit of positive elevator trim to continue a climb. So that's easy enough, but that's not what people typically complain about in this plane. Usually the complaint is that it's hard to land, and not because it's hard to control, but because it's heavy and it's aerodynamic, it has a high wing loading, it tends to be pretty fast in the glide and hard to slow down with the brakes. People overshoot the runway a lot and get in trouble that way. So I'm just going to talk about that and do a little example landing, hopefully. Actually, before I start barnstorming like an idiot, I ought to make at least an amateur attempt to present what I imagine to be a clean and professional-looking approach. Here I am on Sicily, starting out with about 1 kilometer of altitude and several kilometers of horizontal separation, although it's difficult to estimate precisely. I've already got my landing flaps out and my gear, and I'm floating down in a pretty steep descent. Ideally, I think I'd like to be at about 180 kilometers an hour at this stage, but already I'm a little bit steep, so I'm having to back off and slow down to just over 160. I definitely don't want to get any slower than that, but I'm keeping a close eye on it and working the throttle to control my speed as I float down in a steep descent. If I was coming in much steeper, I would have to wave off and go around. But as it stands, I line up pretty neatly for the near edge of the runway, and as I arrive, I'll give a little extra throttle and flare. Keep in mind this aircraft is a tricycle, so don't flare too hard or you'll hit the tail. And touch down very gently. And then immediately back off on the throttle, brake, full brake.
Just a bit of a note for historical accuracy.
raise your flaps when you're braking. It will decrease your lift and give you better braking power, and also actual pilots did this to reduce foreign object damage from things kicked up on the runway. Well, that went as well as could be expected, especially considering that the map that we were on there, Sicily, is not only a beautiful location, but has some very short runways, so it's a good challenge location for practicing short landings. And in spite of that, we set down quite neatly with room to spare. But, of course, War Thunder is a combat flight simulator, and most of your landings are not going to be under such ideal circumstances. More typically, you're going to be coming in hot, with a lot of excess speed, which you're not going to want to give up any earlier than necessary because you're in a combat zone. So you won't have the luxury of starting your glide slope at a low initial speed. You'll be coming in pretty hot, and the question is, how do you burn off that excess speed? Well, this aircraft is heavy and sleek, and it has a high wing loading, so if you just glide in a straight line, you may lose altitude rapidly, but it's not going to be easy to slow down. What will kill our speed is any sort of hard maneuvering, and we can take advantage of that. Here I'm coming in hot, and I'm burning off the excess speed with the series of S-curves as I approach the runway. As the speed drops below 400 kilometers an hour, I can drop combat flaps. Once I get down below about 300, I can deploy the gear. 270 or so takeoff flaps, and once you're under about 240 or 250, you can deploy landing flaps. Your goal is to be below 200 kilometers an hour as you cross the threshold of the runway, and touch down somewhere between 180 down to 160. Note that you'll have to hold the nose down as you cycle through combat flaps and landing flaps in particular. It'll really want to pull up, so you have to hold it down. And incidentally, I really can't overstate how essential it is to use the flaps on this aircraft in particular. It depends on them to dissipate its excess speed. Without them, you're going to be coming in fast, and it'll take a lot more runway to slow down. Through this entire approach, the throttle has been at idle. When you're coming in hot like this, you really don't rely on throttle at all. You just glide it in. And indeed, landing a P-38 with damaged or inoperative engines is not really any different than an ordinary hot combat landing, in my experience in War Thunder anyway. So 2 other tricks that might prove useful. One is that if you're flying the L model of the Lightning, and in practice this would be true on the later J models, but not in War Thunder, you have the dive recovery flaps, which is your air brake key. And the primary function of those is actually as flaps. It's actually to increase lift so that you can pull out of a dive. But its secondary effect is that it also increases drag. So it also acts as air brakes. And it's basically, it's another set of flaps that you can use, which have the advantage of being impossible to tear off. They are very, very rugged indeed. So if you are dealing with a really steep descent angle, maybe you're coming in with a damaged aircraft under fire, can't afford to the niceties of a longer approach, you can use those to bleed off a lot of speed on your final approach as well. So here I am coming in very hot, air brakes extended. I'll just do some rapid turns here. Regular flaps as soon as I'm below 400. Gear down at 3. Going through to landing flaps. At this point I can go ahead and take the air brake back up. Roll in. Level out. And flare. Not quite yet. There we go. Also, as a side note, because the dive recovery flaps are so robust, they are very valuable as an emergency alternative flap system. If you've lost your primary flaps for whatever reason, don't forget that you can use the dive recovery flaps to help you land at a controlled speed. You can even use them to help control your attitude if your elevator has been damaged. Unlike regular flaps, they won't fail if you have to use them at high speed. But of course, this entire approach, zigging and zagging back and forth across the in front of the runway, is an air traffic control nightmare. You can get away with it in War Thunder because it's chaos out there anyway. But from what I gather, real pilots took the risk of mid-air collision a little more seriously, so they needed a more predictable and controlled way to burn off their excess energy. One way to do that is what's called a side slip approach. Now, this is not a technique that I'm particularly familiar with. I haven't practiced it much and I won't do it justice, but I ought to try to cover it since it's on topic. The idea is that you conduct the whole approach with the rudder fully deflected to one direction or another, and of course compensating by cross-controlling in the opposite direction with the ailerons, angling the aircraft to the side as you skid down on your descent toward the runway. Of course, the liability doing this is that cross-controlling like this, you can spin your aircraft if you're not careful. But the idea is that if you do it properly, you are essentially using the whole side of your fuselage as a big air brake. Now, this isn't a complete substitute for the barnstorming technique that I described earlier. It won't let you bleed off tons of airspeed on your approach. It's more about dumping excess altitude in a steep but controlled, slow descent. But of course, the whole theory here is that you're using the side of your fuselage to brake with, and the P-38 being made entirely of tubes doesn't really have a fuselage, and the tail booms are not functionally equivalent for this purpose. So, on the whole, I don't think it's very well suited to take advantage of this technique, and that's one reason I haven't practiced that technique very much. But still, in a pinch, it might be worth trying. Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching, and join me next time when I'll fly the P-47 and experiment with alternative landing techniques. Setch out.